Very pleasant Feast of Trumpets to everyone. It's great to be here with you. Just a note about the format that we'll be using today. So I will be giving a sermonette and a short offertory message. We will not be physically collecting the offering in baskets. There is a box at the back of the hall where you can put your offering envelopes in if you have one. There are some extra envelopes back there as well. Or, of course, you can make your offering donation online or via the postal mail as in the past. So as we begin to focus in on what we can learn from observing the Feast of Trumpets, let's begin in Leviticus 23. Leviticus 23 in verse 24. And I'll be reading this from the English Standard Version. It says, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the 1st day of the month, you shall observe a day of solemn rest, a memorial proclaimed with a blast of trumpets." I'd like to focus on the phrasing here that describes this day as a memorial proclaimed with blast of trumpets. So the trumpets associated with this day are the mechanism by which the purpose of the day is announced or declared. That purpose is, as it states, to observe a day of solemn rest or Sabbath rest, as the New King James has it, as a memorial. The word translated memorial here could also be translated as reminder, remembrance, or record. And the phrase translated as blowing of trumpets could also be translated as alarm, signal, a battle cry, or a shout of joy. Putting those meanings together, we have a day that is meant to bring to the forefront of our memory an alarm or signal associated with a context of alertness and urgency due to an important event or transition, either dangerous or joyous. One future event and massive transition that is memorialized or brought to remembrance through this day is found in Joel chapter 2, verse 1, and I'll again be reading from the English Standard Version. Here Joel wrote, "Blow a trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is near." So Joel wrote both about the day of the Lord that occurred with the punishment and captivity of the nation at that time, and as a dual prophecy about events that would occur at the end time. The day of the Lord is one of those topics that we don't really love to think about, but must. It is a time of judgment and its future fulfillment on humanity, a global time of reckoning that cannot be sidestepped, and an inescapable transferal of authority and control out of men's hands and into God's hands. We are reminded on this day through the symbolism of the trumpet that that day is coming, and to order the choices and priorities of our lives accordingly. So in the time that we have remaining, let's examine a connection between the judgment of man that is to come and the element of judgment that is inherent in the giving of an offering, to learn both about the meaning of this day and the offering that will be collected today. Let's read the familiar command to bring an offering in each festival season, and notice especially that there is a specific criteria defined for how we are to appear as we bring it, and an element of judgment associated with that criteria. So let's read Deuteronomy 16:16, and I'll be reading this from the English Standard. Deuteronomy 16:16, which says, 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, at the Feast of Weeks, and at the Feast of Booths, they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Now, in this verse, when God says that we are not to appear empty-handed before him, the word empty could be translated in empty condition, in vain, void, or without effect. So this is clearly talking as much about the condition of a person's heart and mind and character as about the condition of their wallet. The first part of the sentence states that those who come shall not appear in this condition, and a consequence for doing so, a judgment, is implied. There are multiple verses that use the same phrase, empty-handed. We'll briefly review two of those to get a clearer picture of what we need to be thinking about, both with respect to God's overall judgment on mankind and his judgment on the individual choices that we make throughout life. One of those scriptures is found in Deuteronomy 15. I'm going to switch to the New King James Version for this. So Deuteronomy 15, starting in verse 12. It says, if your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you and serves you 6 years, then in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. Verse 13, and when you send him away free from you, you shall not let him go away empty-handed. The verses that come next go on to say that when the servant, who in context was typically an indentured servant that arrived at that status by having a financial obligation that they couldn't pay, when the servant was released, the master was to give generously to them from their own possessions. Now that was done for two reasons. One, to recognize the increase that the servant had brought to the master, and two, to provide a start for the servant's transition into independent life. The key thing to focus on here is that the instruction to masters to not let the servants go away empty-handed uses the same words as the instruction to not come before God empty-handed. So in setting these regulations, God was setting an expectation both for this specific type of relationship and in a broad sense that would extend beyond master-servant scenarios. So those with responsibility for others, those in control of what happens to others, those in authority, are expected not to let the person whose lives they influence leave the relationship in empty condition, in vain, void, or without effect. Again, very much a combination of heart and character impact beyond a financial impact. This principle applies to a multitude of relationships, employers and employees, those who govern and the governed, husbands and wives, parents and children, ministers and members. Let's go to a second passage with the phrase empty-handed. It's in Mark chapter 12. Mark chapter 12, starting in verse 1. Then he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and set a hedge around it, dug a place for the wine vat, and built a tower. And he leased it to vine dressers and went into a far country. Now at vintage time he sent a servant to the vine dressers that he might receive some of the fruit of the vineyard from the vine dressers. And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Now the verses that come next in this parable, and in the parallel account in Luke 20, go on to illustrate Judah's and Israel's overall response to God, the owner of the vineyard that's pictured here. Some of his messengers were wounded and shamefully treated. Some were killed, and ultimately they killed his own son also, showing no more respect for him than a commonplace messenger. The Greek word translated empty here has essentially the same implication as the word empty in the Old Testament scriptures. Vain, fruitless, without effect, of no purpose. So the key thing to focus on here then is the broad expectation conveyed for those whose lives are influenced by others who have responsibility or control or authority over them. Just as with the expectations for people on the other side of the relationship that exert the influence, the people on the side that receives it are not to respond in a way that causes the influencer to leave the relationship vain, fruitless, having no purpose, and without effect. So once again, this principle applies to every type of relationship that we can imagine. The deciding factor that determines the outcome in all these relationships comes down to basically one character trait. And we all get to experience both sides. In some relationships, we are the influencer with more control. In some relationships, we are the influenced. Whether we are the influencer or the influenced at any given time in any given relationship, the outcome is determined by whether each side behaves selflessly or selfishly. We all kind of wish there was a different formula for having a good outcome that wasn't so hard, but there just isn't. When we choose more outgoing, unselfish love, the outcomes in our relationships are better. When we choose less, the outcomes are worse. The key lesson in the instructions is not to treat others in a way that leaves them empty-handed, or to appear before God empty-handed, and that is that we are to live selflessly. It's the key point of the instruction. Coming back to the theme of judgment for this day specifically, if we choose not to live selflessly, the warning is clear that there is a consequence. In the instructions for those who influence in the parable highlighting historical responses of the influenced, it is clear in both cases that when the wrong approach is chosen, judgment will come. And that judgment is occurring. We can see it all over the planet in natural consequences for wrong choices. There's masses of people in every station of life who are leaving one another and God empty-handed in relationships. And it's hard to live in that environment. What matters a whole lot more than that is that we have a choice. And it matters more what we choose to do individually within our own relationships. Ultimately, we understand through what is prophesied that mankind as a whole will not change directions, and that God's judgment for that will culminate in the day of the Lord. But we have a choice now to follow the path that God defines and pursue a different and much better outcome. This day, through its theme of judgment, reminds us of what's at stake and the urgency of choosing rightly. Let's now focus specifically on applying these lessons to the offering that we're about to give. We read in Deuteronomy 16:16 earlier, and it contains the instruction to not appear before God in the festival seasons empty-handed. The same phrase does also indicate not coming with hands that are literally empty, hands without something to give or offer. The next verse in Deuteronomy, of course, continues the instruction to give as we are able, according to the blessings that God has given to us. In our modern world, there are 100 ways to transfer money, either physically or electronically, or some kind of money equivalent for those who are into that sort of thing. With any of them, the reality is that any financial interaction we participate in is an inherent statement of what we value. If we saw no value in the item or the service that we receive in return, or in what the money supports when we give, then we wouldn't exchange the money or the money equivalent for it. When we allocate money repeatedly to the same use over and over again, that's a statement of commitment. In Deuteronomy 16:16, when God tells us not to appear before him empty-handed, one of the clear indications based on what we've reviewed today is that we are not to appear before him without commitment. So to state it another way, one of the most important functions of an offering is simply to demonstrate commitment through a tangible statement of value in the form of a monetary offering. Like the other symbols associated with God's way of life, there is rich meaning and a blessing in having the opportunity to confirm our commitment to God in this way. So as we give our offerings today, let's rejoice that we can understand the future events that this feast memorializes and reminds us of, and in the blessing of having the opportunity to commit ourselves to the way of life and the great plan of salvation that what it pictures will bring about. So for the offertory music today, we'll have a